Good afternoon. Thank you for attending my talk. It's called Identity Crisis, Bending Spring Security to Your Advanced Use Cases. It's a bit of a mouthful, right? My name is Cristian Schuszter. I will be giving this talk to you today. I hope it will be entertaining, and I hope you're going to learn something from it. Now, just a brief introduction on who am I. You might think I work in construction because I have this helmet all the time on, but actually it's because I work at CERN, the largest particle physics laboratory in the world. I work as a software engineer, not as a physicist, but I also have a bit of a background in academia, and I've been working in different roles in computer security. I was working for the main CERN SSO for a few years, and now I work on something called business computing, okay? So when people think about CERN, they kind of think about this big ring over here, which is 100 meters underground. Collisions happen at 4 points on the circle. Data gets produced 40 million times a second and so on. We're not going to be talking about that, as you might expect, because we're talking about Spring Security in Java, right? So this is more or less our business, but we also have another kind of business, a bit more close to what you might be used to in your day-to-day life. We're used to enterprise applications. Why? Because we're an international organization. Lots of the things that we do are more or less built around decades and decades of, let's say, legacy systems that need to evolve, that need to be developed. We put our first Java application in production in 1998, and it's still being maintained nowadays. It's one of our biggest document handling applications and so on. And we have a lot of different domains that we cover in my business computing group, right? So we cover finance, procurement. This is like a small overview of the finance systems that you see over there. The diagram is on purpose made unreadable because it doesn't make a lot of sense for us to talk about that today. It's just for you to understand that complexity is something that we deal with in our day-to-day. And enterprise applications can be hard. Security is hard by default. And what could we do about it? What are we doing about it nowadays? These are kind of questions that we're going to be asking and answering ourselves during the talk today. Now, this is a bit of an overview of what we're going to be talking about. So we're going to talk about Spring Security 6.5, because now with Spring Boot 3.5.0, released a couple of weeks ago, we have Spring Security 6.5. Unfortunately, some of the things that I'll be talking about have still not been documented. Maybe I will open a pull request at some point to actually do that. But to ease into the conversation, we're going to be talking about OIDC and some flavors of implementing it in your applications. Maybe this will be something interesting for you. A couple of new quality of life features, so basically stuff that you might want to be using in your Spring applications, but you don't know about them. And then something about a user impersonation service, right? So how would we go around implementing that using modern Spring Security features, okay? Now, first and foremost, I invite you to scan that QR code and to do a little icebreaker quiz to see how advanced you are in your Spring knowledge, because this is a Spring Security advanced course, right? I'm just going to change the slide for a second because you'll see the same thing here. Now, the first slide is more or less inspirational, right? What comes to mind when you think Spring Security? Right? So just drop in some words over there. You're going to be seeing them popping up on the screen. Boring. Okay, then why did you come to the presentation? Course, OTP, password, secure, magic. Okay, configuration, authentication, yada yada. Okay, the words are shuffling. Seems like my laptop is dying for some. Yeah, the animations are a bit too wild to be handled. Okay. I can see that. Authentication, confusion, filters. Oh my God, too many people connected. I think I'm on the free plan, so stop connecting. It's good. All right, so complex. Look, this is something that I was looking for. Complicated. Okay, vulnerability. Fine, that's beautiful. I assume most of you connected. So now I'm going to do a really quick pop quiz just to see if you're with me. Once you prove to me that you are with me, then we can actually go further on in the presentation, okay? These will be Spring security questions, nothing really difficult or hard, so let's go. The first one to answer fast gets more points. What's one key advantage of using pre-authorized over secured in Spring Security? Tick-tock, tick-tock, tick-tock. You have like 15 seconds to answer, okay? The good answer will pop up eventually somewhere. Oh, 3, 2, 1, and yes, exactly. Pre-authorized supports spell and secured doesn't. That's one key advantage. And then, okay, most of you got it right. This is actually really good, huh? Now let's look at the leaderboard. Who's, okay, Sakura. Good job, Sakura. Amazing. Unfortunately, you don't win anything here, but you get to see your name on the board. Okay, next one. Next question. Really fast. There used to be 4 questions, but now there are only 2 because we don't have time, 45 minutes. What's the primary difference between the Spring Starter OAuth2 client and OAuth2 resource server libraries, according to you guys? And then it's like 1 and 2 in parentheses, so we don't repeat the whole sausage, huh? Tick-tock, 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 tick-tock. Fastest wins, remember. Yes, so the first one supports, well, it supports OAuth2, but it also supports OIDC client functionalities. And the second one is more for securing your APIs, okay? So something interesting there. Now, the leaderboard has changed a bit. So LoveSite got more points for this one. Congratulations, LoveSite. And LoveSite is the winner. Congrats. If I find a certain lanyard, come to me after the talk, and maybe we can do something about giving you a prize. All right. Now, why did we do this? That's a good question. I ask myself the same thing sometimes. Well, if you look at Spring in general, it has a lot of projects inside it and so on. So this is a bit of a tier list of what you might see in a Spring application. You start with Spring MVC, web, everybody's happy, the documentation is there and all that. Then you go down the rabbit hole, right? And then you end up with Spring Security, which is, well, I mean, it's not like aspect-oriented programming or anything like that, where you need like PhDs in software engineering to get things right, but it's not the easiest thing in the world, right? And you're not the only one saying that, right? So if you do like a quick search, yeah, if you do a quick search on Spring Security on the web, you might see things like this, right? So I really love Spring Boot, but learning Spring Security has made me shocked, like capital letters. And then there's like holy emoji, and yeah, so the documentation is yet another beast. Every time I try to do something, I find it deprecated, and I have used Node Express and so on for so much time, but it took me 2 days, 6 hours of coding just to figure out how to do JWT authentication, right? And this is from not that long ago, huh? And then there's like other questions, like how can someone learn authentication in Spring Boot? Like innocent people asking questions on Reddit, and then the answer is it's not learnable, right? It's been designed by the beepiest thing you can even try to learn. Seriously, I did PHP coding for over a decade. Whoever implemented Spring Security deserved to burn in hell. Okay. Yeah, this is from like a couple of weeks ago, maybe like, let's say 1 month ago that I found this post. So it seems that the sentiment is there, right? Maybe we can do something about it. Maybe I can change your opinions. If you don't know where to start, though, there's a very interesting series of talks that Daniel is giving at Devox, at other venues, and so on. So I wholeheartedly recommend you, if you want to learn the basics and if you want to go really well deep into the Spring Security concepts, I would recommend you watch these talks if you're not a documentation reading kind of person, okay? So yeah, Spring Security is a bit like IKEA furniture, right? It's modular, it's powerful, but the instructions will make you cry. That's kind of the gist of it, right? So why would we even use Spring Security? How many of you are going with this in your production environments? Rather than actually implementing complex security rules and so on, you just put a reverse proxy or whatever in front of your application, and then you're done with it, right? Are you doing that? Is anybody doing that? Okay, not that many people. Sure, why? Because usually you need more flexibility out of your applications. You need more complex business logic to validate who has access to certain things and so on. So you end up writing code for that, right? Fine. Now, let's look a bit at OIDC, OAuth2 OAuth2, so authorization, authentication, and so on. First, if you do a simple, if you're developing a simple web application, which is server-side rendered, you're in luck, because this is one of the easiest things to implement, right? You have Spring Boot OAuth client, Spring Security OAuth clients, which basically just handles all the complex calls and all that for the OAuth2 flow with the identity provider, right? By just handling it in the backend, right? It does it for you, you're very happy. The user just sends its credential to the identity provider and then gets redirected to the application. That's perfect. However, most of you are probably not doing that because you're building APIs. How many of you are building APIs? Yeah, you see? That's the problem. So how many of you are building server-side rendered applications? Okay, 3 people in the room, yes. Which is, yeah, it's maybe something to think about as well, because every decision that you make adds complexity. In the case of OAuth2 research server, this is taken actually from the Spring documentation, right? So you have a security filter chain, which takes the bearer token, it figures out which authentication manager to use, and then it injects into the security holder a principal, right? Like every other authentication mechanism that you might use, right? It's just, this is using JWT tokens, which you know about, right? Yes? Yes? Okay. People are nodding. That's good. Yes. So this is mostly the way you would handle API protection, right? You would expect somebody to call you with some claims in the token. You verify those claims, and everybody's happy, right? Now, let's have a quick look at how that works and what the nuances are in the implementation, and then we'll move on to a bit more complex things, okay? So I have here a simple starter project. Maybe just to give you a context, I have a Keycloak server running on localhost 8080, okay? As you might expect, the username and password are admin and admin. And I have here, well, I have another realm, actually. I have a realm called app, and inside here, I have 2 users that you might know from your security courses, Alice and Bob, right? So each of them are allowed to log into a certain application, and they have role mappings, okay? So this is something that you might configure on your Azure, whatever you're using, right? We're using Keycloak at CERN. This is like a nice little example that uses Keycloak for you guys. Now, you see Alice has normal user and admin as her roles, and Bob only has normal user, right? So nothing special here, is just to show you that basically we will be using these roles somehow, okay? And my Spring Boot application, well, actually my applications, because I have a few of them here. One is an example of an OAuth client, one is an example of a resource server. Maybe, should I zoom in a bit? Maybe a bit more, like for the menus and all that? I hope it's readable. Okay, so if we start with the OAuth client, now what you usually would do is just include this dependency in your project, and everybody's happy, right? Spring Starter OAuth2 client, magic. Now, of course, it's not magic because you do need to configure it in some way. How do you do it? Well, usually you plug things into your application YAML. Okay, this is like just to be able to connect to the database and so on if I want to use it. But this is the chunk that we're talking about here, right? So I am saying that, okay, I'm using my app as a client ID. I have this authorization code flow used to log into my application. I'm hoping the issuer is from here, so localhost 8080, right? Because I'm running everything locally. And I'm getting some scopes from here, and client authentication method none. Okay, fine, whatever. And then in the security config, I define a filter chain, as you might expect, and this filter chain says, okay, I want to authorize HTTP requests. For every request, I want it to be authenticated, right? And then I also want to create sessions for the users that log in. Now, The default, let's say the default is that. If I don't do this part here, what will happen? Well, let's run the application really fast. Okay. Is my tunnel up? Yeah. All right, let's go. Localhost 8000 because, okay. This is the beautiful page that your very friendly framework, right? I configured everything. I said, okay, I want to use this kind of authentication, and you get a nice 403 page by default, right? When you enable OAuth2, right? Why? Because I just removed basically that piece of code there. What you want to do is to http.auth2 login. Thank you, AI. Yeah, and you use this customizer, which basically has some sane defaults for you, right? And it basically says, okay, I will do all the flow and search for the first registration from my YAML. So from here, I will try to figure out. You're not telling it which server to call, right? Why? Because based on the issuer URI, it knows how to form this well-known endpoints URL that it uses to call the server. And then it says, hey, can you give me some more information? What are the keys that I should use to verify and so on? It auto-configures itself, and magically, when the application reloads and I uncommented that piece of code over there, I get the Keycloak sign-in page, right? Because I get redirected to my identity provider. So I log in as Alice, and I have a dumb timeleaf template, which basically, because it's server-side rendered, right? Which just returns me who's the user that's authenticated and the roles of the person. So let's have a quick look at that. So what I'm passing as a parameter to my template is basically the principal, right? So this principal is like, oh God, get principal, which is from my little controller here, and I'm just using that from the Spring Security information, right? So I get the authorities basically meaning the roles, right? And by default, you've seen here that it says scope email, OIDC user, and scope profile, right? And scope OpenID. I mean, these are not really the roles, right? These are the scopes that I requested for my application. It's a sane default, but the sane default is not actually the thing which is super useful to me. And we'll see in a second how we can do better, maybe. Now, for the resource server, it all starts with, let's go to the configuration. It looks very similar to the other one. It's just way smaller, right? Because here I just validate the tokens. I don't care how you get them, right? I just log into my application, and eventually on the other side, I get I get tokens and I validate them. The only thing that I care about is the issuer URI, so that I can take the token, pass it through my application, see that it's from the right place, and that's it. So if I run that application, actually I provide a Swagger interface for it, so you guys can see it better. Any moment now? Yeah, there we go. So I have 3 dumb endpoints there. They don't do a lot. Why did I log in instantly? Because I'm already logged in, right? So maybe if I open a private window here and I click authorize, I end up here, right? So again, I log in as Alice, and let's get the roles of the person. Here I get something else. I get the actual roles that you saw in Keycloak. You'll see why in a second. And some other endpoints just to verify if I'm an admin, for example, returns true or false, right? Very dumb endpoints and so on. Now, the thing is, these tokens are interesting to look at. You go to jwt.io, you can paste this nice token into the UI here, right? And then you get a lot of information about who is issuing it, when it expires, et cetera, et cetera. So we can see where the roles are. They're nested inside the token. You see, they're inside my app, roles, admin, normal user, right? And it's in resource access. So it's quite hard to reach them. We'll see what we can do about it, right? And again, for the configuration, it's actually quite simple. you just mention that, okay, I want to have an OAuth2 resource server, and maybe you configure it in some way. So you use JWT authentication in this situation, and that's it. And then I have a bunch of other things here that we will go over in a second. So that's the main difference. Usually, in your cases, as API developers, you would just use resource servers, so that's it. You slap it on top of your application, you do 2, 3 small config things, and you're done, right? It's not that hellish, right? Okay, well, moving onwards, you might have seen there in the client authentication methods, right? I said there that, okay, I'm using authorization grant type authorization code, and I use client authentication method none, okay? So you have 2 types of clients in OAuth OIDC, right? You have public clients and private clients, right? The private ones, you get a client secret for them as well. So you can use that one to initiate the calls. However, in your case, if you have a single page application that wants to call an API, of course you can't store that client secret in the front end, right? You cannot use it to initiate the authentication process. So what do? You create it as a public client, and then we have something called PKCE, so proof key for code exchange by OAuth public clients, that is used by default by Spring Boot, so this is a very nice, sane default, which allows you to say, I don't want to use any client authentication method, but the server will take care of the fact that, you know, I'm sending this special key that it's kind of like a nonce, which the server also agrees with, so you can't do all sorts of crazy stuff, and your thing is secure. You cannot log in from other weird places. How? Based on the redirect URIs, right? So in your UI, you get the redirect URI back to your application. And you usually store a list of them. And if, for whatever reason, evilbank.com is the redirect URI that you pass to the server, of course, it's not going to work unless you actually explicitly allow it from your authorization server and so on. So just a nice thing to know about, that authentication method none doesn't mean that you're exposing your credentials to the web. Right. Now, let's look a bit further at some cool new quality of life features that you might see in Spring Security 6.4 and onwards. So these are things which are documented, but maybe not in the best way possible. So one very cool thing is, like, as you have seen in this JWT token that I was just showing you a second ago, well, this is another one, it doesn't matter. So we have a bunch of nested claims there, right? So you see resource access and so on, my app, blah, blah, blah. So if I want to access something, anything in the claims of my token, I either do it the old-fashioned way of just, you know, taking the object, getting the claims from, like the map of claims from the object, checking inside it and so on, or I can look at this meta-annotation expression, which basically allows me to define a decorator, well, an interface, in this case, where I put my claim as a parameter, and then I can use it. You see, like in my method, I can just say, okay, user claim equals preferred username. So it will get the preferred username from that thing by evaluating the spell expression, right? So you can use the parameter that you pass to this thing there, and auto-magically it sucks it out of your authentication claims, right? So, which is great because maybe you want to do some more complex checks, and you want to hide that complexity away somewhere and make sure the framework takes care of it, right? So, and similarly, you can also, this is completely undocumented, unfortunately. So you can also use a spell expression parser in order to do that, to get the roles out of your token, right? So don't worry too much about what you're seeing right here. We'll see the actual code on how it works, but what I want to do is access in my token something inside resource access, my app, roles, right? You could do that programmatically, of course, but wouldn't it be nicer if when I do the processing of the token, when my API gets called, I already get those, right? Because you saw the default roles that I have are the scopes. They're not the actual roles themselves. So, demo, I want to access this, right? Resource access, and I don't want account. I want resource access, my app, so for this current application, roles, and I want to get this list here, right? The way we do it is using Oof, I zoomed in too much. Just a second. Yeah, it's using this thing. So I'm creating a bean of type auth converter, right? And basically I say, okay, I want to have a new JWT authentication converter here, and I want to parse this expression. Like this is just a spell expression to access things nested inside my object, inside my JWT object. And then I say, okay, look, so just set the authority prefix to role as we're used to, and so on, and then set it as that, and return it as a bean, right? And then the bean, I just use it the moment I configure my OAuth2 resource server. So I have here, okay, OAuth2 resource server, I'm using JWT authentication, and with the JWT authentication, I have a specific authentication converter that is used by Spring Boot to parse my tokens, right? So the moment this thing comes, I mean, we can put a breakpoint somewhere, but basically the moment my my token gets sent here, let's make sure we're logged in, yes. And I get the list of roles. It parses them, right? So it gets them from the token here. It parses nicely the list, and basically what I'm returning from my hello controller here is just the authorities from my authentication object, right? So this is just a JWT authentication token that I get from my security context. You can use this annotation, current security context, or you can inject the principal, and then from the principal you can get the authentication object. It's the same thing. So either you use this, or you say authentication principal. Yeah. Well, maybe I don't want the, I know that this is the authentication object, and then I can get the claims and so on. Well, the nice thing here is that then everything which is plugged into my application, like the spell has role and so on, admin, it works out of the box. So for example, with Alice, we see that we have admin and normal user as the roles, right? So this endpoint, which has a pre-authorize on it, says checking if you have the role admin, and it returns true. This will just work out of the box for Alice, right? But if I do it as Bob, sorry, yeah. If I log in as Bob here, and I call this admin, I get the 403 back, right? Because I don't have that role, right? So it's great because it parses my token and it gives me the roles that I want, or it gives me the claims that I want from the token without me having to think a lot about it, right? So it's quite pluggable. Now, the second part about the template annotation expressions, I have here a user claim in the OAuth client, for example. And I say, okay, I want to access attributes, and then this funny notation here is basically saying, use this and parameterize my string over there so that I can get that attribute which is corresponding to that string in my map, right? And you need to keep it at runtime and so on, of course. So this user claim, then I can use it here for the hello endpoint, right? So if I run my other application, my auth client application, this is unfortunately not strongly typed. So it says here, I don't know what attributes is. So that's sad because, well, it knows you're using OAuth2 client and you have an OAuth2 authenticated principal, which has an attributes object in here. However, for the resource server, you get a completely no, sorry, what was it? JWT. Yeah, you get this object, right? So you get an abstract OAuth2 token and so on. So it's a completely different hierarchy of things, which is not great because this one, if I copy paste it and I put it in the other, in the resource server project, nothing will really work well anymore. Now, if I yeah, you see, so I'm logged in as Bob because it used this beautiful spell expression to get the preferred username out of my JWT token, right? And this is great and very useful for me, especially as an application developer that maybe doesn't care that much about all the Spring security stuff, and I just want to get my job done for implementing a certain feature. All right, now, back to this. I jumped a bit, sorry. Yeah, now we're getting to the last, let's say, meaty bit of the presentation, where I will be showing you how one might go around implementing a user impersonation feature, okay? So this is something that you might see often. It's tricky because you need to do it in a single-page application context where nothing is secure, right? So you can't trust what the UI is sending you. Well, you can trust the tokens that the UI is sending you, right? But you on the back end, you need to implement it in a certain way to make sure that everything works properly, right? And why do we want to do that? Well, legacy is a good word, and also supporting our users is also another one. At CERN, we don't give access to people to the main Keycloak instance, right? So you can't just put your admin credentials and use the nice user impersonation feature that you have in the admin screen. Instead of that, what we can do is give APIs to people to get information about certain users of their applications, and only their applications, right? So if you provide an API for people to get roles of others in a safe way, then, of course, what you can do is start thinking of how you might do the impersonation logic here. So you might want to see what the other user sees, because the application is old, it's complex, it's using God knows what. And instead of having to go through a million logs, a million database tables, or I don't know exactly how you guys are making sure that everything works properly, assuming there's no proper telemetry implemented, how do we do it, right? So an interesting way of doing it is if you look at the way the server side, the resource server authentication works. So this is a nice diagram from the Spring documentation, which says that I'm sending my bearer token, my authentication manager gives me back a JWT. But before that, there's this place over here called the JWT authentication provider that uses two different beans, the decoder and the authentication converter. The decoder is very simple. It takes the string and it transforms it into an actual JWT object, right? Something with the claims and so on inside it. The authentication converter, though, allows you to add extra stuff on top of it. So maybe you want to do something with your authentication token. Maybe you want to parse certain things or put it in a certain format. And then it passes back to the filter chain and goes to your actual application, right? So let me explain how we might want to implement it. You have your web browser. You're happy, right? You talk to your SSO provider. You get an authentication token, like we saw with the server-side rendering, with the resource server example, right? You get the JWT token back. Now, you use that JWT token to talk to your API, but your API checks beforehand, hey, did I say that I want to impersonate somebody else? Yes. Am I allowed to do that by doing various checks, right? Verifying if this person that is in the token right now, because the tokens are not mutable, right? You cannot take a JWT token, change the content, send it to the server, and be happy with that. No, you can check on the back end that, okay, what I got is this. This person wants to be somebody else through a header, through a cookie, whatever you use to mention that. And I create something new. I get the claims of that other person from, in this case, it's going to be from the database directly from Keycloak, but imagine you might have an API which gives you the roles of a person in an application. You set it inside your token, and then from then on, the rest of your application believes that you're Bob, you're not Alice, right? If Alice, for example, wants to do that. We'll see in a second how it looks like in terms of implementation. There's a caveat, of course. What the front end sees is different from what the back end sees, right? Because the front end has your token, the one that you're logged in as right now. It passes it to the back end. The back end does some mangling, but the problem there is that the front end doesn't know, right? And one elegant solution that you can come up with is just provide an endpoint saying, who am I? But like, who am I right now in terms of what the server thinks, right? Not what the UI sees. And it just returns you back a set of claims or whatever with some new, with like the new token contents, right? So the arrow going upwards with the new token saying Alice and roles and so on, right? And you're saying that you're logging as Alice and you're actually Bob. The sub is basically the username in this situation. Okay, enough talk. Let me show you how it works. Stopping all of this. All right, so the usual suspects, of course. So I guess I have the same the same JWT authorities converted that I showed you before, right? So I know what roles my current user has. I have the filter chain and so on, and here I plug in something called the JWT authentication converter, right, which is injected as a bean. So I have this login as JWT authentication converter that implements a converter from JWT to abstract authentication token. So this is the interface that you need to implement if you want to do a custom conversion of your token, right? So what happens here is that, okay, maybe let's just get rid of all of this. And this is the method that you need to implement. You return the abstract authentication token and you convert it from a JWT, okay? What do I have in the JWT? Well, things, claims, right? So first, maybe you want to check if the login as user is nobody. This is a cookie, right? So I'm just going to say login as that person, and that's it. If you don't want to log in as anybody else, then it's fine. We just skip all this part, and we return the authentication token down the filter chain, okay? So we keep the exact identical thing. Otherwise, you might want to check, is admin this person, and so on. Yeah, we're not going to check this part, right? And then I have a couple of services here. So I have a DAO, which basically allows me to say, okay, get roles for username. And then I get it for this particular user that I'm logged in as. Let's assume the person exists, and so on. And then, to save you time, we create a new JWT token, because we can, right? So nobody will validate this token again in the backend, in the sense that nobody will check that we're not changing the string value, let's say. We're just enhancing the information with what we want to send down to the backend, right? So we say, okay, this is the preferred username claim, because you get all the claims, and then you replace some of them using, okay, get me the username for this person, for the user ID, and then you create your resource access claims, map of my app, roles, and so on. Why? Because, of course, you want the roles that are inside, like the backend layer, to be the ones of the person that you're impersonating. You're not admin anymore, even if maybe you were admin at some point, right? And then you return it back. So maybe I'll show you in practice how this would work. I can also share the code with you, of course, afterwards. Okay. Oops, sorry. Yeah. All right. And we also have a really dumb small UI here. npm run dev, maybe, yeah. Wrong browser, sorry. Okay, so currently I'm logged in as Alice, and I also have an endpoint on the server side which takes the claim that the backend sees and says, look, I am whatever, preferred username Alice, name Alice. Okay, so currently I'm Alice, my roles are Alice's roles, and the server on the backend, it also thinks that I'm Alice, right? Now, I will just briefly set a cookie using the certain things. Okay, fine, I need to log in as myself this time. Now, I'm going to use one of my colleagues as a guinea pig. I'm going to search for him. Yes. And I'll click impersonate. Amazing, I'm him. How do I know I'm him? Because if I look at my application cookies, that's why I'm running on localhost.cern.ch, because the cookie is set on the .cern.ch domain, okay? It's just a nice way, a nice trick. So now if I refresh the thing, well, the server thinks I'm him, but he doesn't exist in the database, of course, so everything will blow up. But if I say that I'm Alice and I want to be Bob, I can just change the cookie here. Nothing happens. And hey, look at this. So I am, well, in this case, actually, that's not very good because I'm logged in as Bob. That was a very... let's go here. Yes, okay. So I log in as Alice. Perfect. Well, the cookie stayed, so that's great. So the cookie says, hey, I log in as Bob, and then some other things here. Now, the token contents, the ones that my UI sees, are these ones, right? So it says, okay, I'm Alice, and so on and so forth, right? However, did I? Wait a second. I'm in the wrong place? Yes. Yeah, I was like hallucinating. So the front end thinks I'm Alice and so on, right? But the moment it gets to the backend, so my roles gotten back from the backend, they only contain normal user now, right? So before it used to be normal user and admin. Why? Because I replaced my token contents with whatever was there in the backend. So everybody thinks that I'm Bob, but actually I'm somebody else that has the power to impersonate that person there, right? Now, you can take this at its face value and maybe use it in your projects if you ever need to implement something like that. And I thank you for your attention. And please rate the session like it says on the thing there. Thank you very much. And if you have any questions, there's like 2 minutes left. Anybody has any questions from the room that I can answer now? Oh yeah, sorry, yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So you could do some caching of the session, right? So the thing is, in this situation, the sessions are stateless. So whenever the backend gets called, the question was, how do you make sure that you reduce traffic, right? Otherwise, you're going to be sending a lot of JWT tokens all the time. So if you do it in a stateless way, like you're supposed to normally do it, you just send the token and convert it every time the call comes, right? However, you might be in a situation where you're like, okay, I'm doing 1,000 calls a minute or whatever. So in that situation, maybe you want to have some sort of session with a very short amount of TTL, right? So like, I don't know, as long as your token, right? So the first time you send your token, you authenticate the person, you keep everything in memory, right? You keep everything on your server or in a distributed cache or whatever, depending on what you want to use. But you do invalidate it eventually, right? Because otherwise, you should invalidate it when the token expires. If the token expires and you're trying to do a call again with the same token, you shouldn't be able to do it anymore, right? So, yeah. You can do sessions if you really want to, yeah. Anything else, or? All right, cool. Thank you very much.
Thank you.